Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Enhancing CTEM with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. We still have a number of people coming in, so we're just going to give it one more minute and then we'll go ahead and kick off the webinar for today. Thank you. Okay, let's get this going. Welcome everyone once again to our webinar, Enhancing Continuous Threat Exposure Management with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. I'm joined by a longtime friend and business associate, Chris Kennedy, today, who we were very lucky to wrangle. Welcome to the webinar today, Chris. Could you
Thanks,
introduce
Carl. Yeah, certainly. Hey, everyone. Glad to be here today. My background here, many of you probably are friends or family or in my network, but those that are not, I'm a 25-year CISO practitioner. Carl and I worked together in the Marine Corps doing cybersecurity things then. I spent 11 years in the Defense Industrial Base, securing the Department of Treasury. I've spent the last 14 years at some of the most premier financial institutions like Bridgewater and Citadel. Today, I'm at Group 1001, which is a annuities financial services portfolio company. And my CEO is also now the CEO of Andretti Global Racing and just got a bid into F1. So it's kind of cool to be a race car and annuities CISO. I do need to caveat all of my conversation today with you guys and Carl is of my own volition and my own personal testimony and being an operational practitioner for so many years, and has nothing to do with any of my experiences at Group 1001.
Well, Chris, I'm extremely happy to have you here and thank you for being here. And for our audience, I'm going to have a hard time keeping this webinar on the rails for sure. It's going to
For
be,
sure.
I think, highly entertaining at times. And Chris and I have done many fireside chats before that we rarely get through the slides. So my job today, if I do a good job, will be to keep us on track, on pace, and to get through the material that we promised to cover. But I do think we'll probably rabbit hole on a couple interesting topics that hopefully you find as interesting as we do. So I'm in from today. I'm actually in London for this week, and so this webinar is actually happening at a slightly strange time, largely because of time zones, me being in London and Chris being on the East Coast. You know, our topic today around continuous threat exposure management and MITRE ATT&CK is timely. I think I've been talking now about CTEM for the last couple months. Gartner published a paper on this framework a couple of years ago, but it really started to heat up, I'd say, in the last 6 months. People are telling me, CISOs I've been talking to at large Fortune 1000s globally, that CTEM is in their top 5 things that they're thinking about as they try to future-proof cyber defensive operations and operations over the next 5 years. They're also telling me that from their perspective, this is hotter right now than zero trust, which is saying something. And that's probably why you're starting to see so much marketing from various different companies to start talking in depth about CTEM as a framework. It is not a technology or a category of technologies. But the one thing that's been missing from our perspective at AttackIQ is while there is this word threat inside of CTEM, continuous threat exposure management, the reality is most companies are not talking about the need to integrate threat-informed defense and MITRE ATT&CK into this exposure management construct. And so today, with Chris, who is just one of the top practitioners in the world, we wanted to explore this concept together. And as we've articulated, we've produced some slides to kind of help frame the conversation, but I definitely think it's going to go off the rails. But before we get into that, Chris, I mean, any initial thoughts from your perspective specific to at the high level CTEM, threat informed defense, and MITRE ATT&CK?
Yeah, a couple of quick ones so we can get into the meat of the content. But first and foremost, I certainly agree with that point of hotter than zero trust, because getting to true zero trust is incredibly difficult unless you're born that way, which means most organizations live in a hybrid environment, and being threat centric in a hybrid environment is going to flow out of this conversation. to big fan of AttackIQ from those that in my past that know, and especially this concept of attack simulation, attack emulation as a way to evidence your controls. And CTEM and where we're going to go in this conversation today is just a natural evolution of the codification of the profession that I think, frankly, you, Carl, and the team at AttackIQ through AttackIQ Academy and whatnot have processized for a long time. And so it's really great to see it like really, getting traction in the industry.
No, I appreciate that. And for those that are unaware, and we'll kind of give a commercial on this at the end, not for Attack IQ and our technology, but Attack IQ Academy, where we do focus on providing advanced free cybersecurity education for people looking to operationalize the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I do think we're going to see a lot more content out of that. But let's go ahead and dive into this. And I have to always plug the Center for Threat Informed Defense. Attack IQ was a founding research partner of the center. We continue to be a part of the center with a lot of other great organizations, both non-for-profits as well as commercial organizations, that we come together to improve the state of the art and the state of the practice of threat informed defense. And I know that Liz, who's helping us out with the webinar today, is going to be putting in the chat session some useful URLs, and one of them will be coming, if it hasn't already, for the Center for Threat Informed Defense. And in fact, John Baker, who runs the center, and I did a presentation a few weeks ago around a project called MITRE, which is the ability for organizations to easily do a very rapid assessment of how well they're executing a threat-informed defense. But before we kind of jump into that, for those that may be new to some of these concepts, we'll just hit a couple quick slides and we'll move in and out of this pretty darn quick. But what is a threat-informed defense? And from the MITRE CTED definition, it's a systematic application of deep understanding of adversarial tradecraft and technology to improve their defenses. And Chris, I think even before we get off the slide, I got to go somewhere with you. I mean, when you think about deep adversary tradecraft and all the things that you own and operate, as a CISO in your organization, leveraging that knowledge and improving your defenses, is this siloed today, or is this, do you see this coming together in more of a centralized approach
Man,
for
man, so I'm going to try not to eat up too much time. So time me to 60 seconds on this, but
all right.
we're still siloed. I mean, look, you got to remember where being threat informed came from, largely born out of Department of Defense and the Department of Defense, and then the Defense Industrial Base Industries that had access to clearances and access to systems where intelligence was readily shared, and then the birth of threat intelligence that came from that in classified channels. And so, like, I remember from my past when I was there, the threat intel guys lived in that box over there that had a TS moniker on it with access to JWICs and CIPRNet, and those systems are where that information was shared. And then they would try to find a way to take that information and make it cross-functionally applied to non-classified assets. And so I think that siloing still exists. It's changed a little bit in the in the commercialization of threat intelligence today, but still it's a practice that folks are still used to being over here, over consumed with information, lots of information coming at them. But then how do you actually weaponize that as a defensive function? Is what this journey is about, is how to teach everyone that's in a defensive practice to richly understand what threat behavior is, and then use that as a way to drive priority. And the birth of the purple team and that lexicon was kind of like the early monikers of that. But I still don't think we're there. I think people still think very much, I run my firewall, but for what?
Yep. Look, you nailed it out of the park. And for the next 542 slides, we're going to talk about that. But that's really exactly what I was looking for. And the reality is, it's hard. It's new and it's hard, and people have a lot of work to do on a daily basis, and so and not enough people to do it. And so sometimes working cross functionally is a high price for some organizations, but it's an even higher price if you don't do it. We're definitely going to talk about that going forward. And so the idea, from the center's perspective, is how do we help organizations, move from their as-is environment to the to-be environment, which we all aspire to be threat-informed in all the decisions that we're making on a daily basis. And in order to make decisions, we have to make things actionable and present it in a way to the business so that they can answer questions. And a lot of those questions, I think most of our audience gets on a daily basis. CISA pops with a new alert for some new piece of malware. You're the board or the CEO now at least knows to ask, "Are we okay?" You see your competitor, maybe a healthcare provider network, in your city, gets compromised. The CEO of the hospital that you work at now is smart enough to ask, "Are we okay? Is that going to be a problem for us?" And so there's lots of questions that are being asked, but we don't have a lot of decision support from a cyber defensive operational perspective to answer those questions as it pertains to the things we own and operate and do. And so one of the things that MITRE ATT&CK and the Center for Threat Informed Defense and all of the participants, we worked on a project called MITRE M3TID. Liz will put in that project that we published a bit ago, which helps organizations take a look at kind of the pillar of a threat-informed defense, which centers around having a good cyber threat intelligence, understanding what from that intelligence, what's important to your organization. And another great mutual friend of Chris and I, Pete Lubin, coined the term hyper-local. That you really need your threat intelligence specific to your organization to be hyper local. And lots of people out there have threat intelligence feeds. They get those feeds, and it's a big blob of information, but it's not necessarily specific about their vertical, about where their buildings are located in what country, because different countries have different threats. And so a big part of the MITID process is evaluating how well you're using cyber threat intelligence, how well you map that intelligence to the defensive measures that an organization operates and owns, and then how well you actually evaluate your use of that threat intelligence and how well you own and operate those defensive capabilities, right? Because you have to trust but verify. And Chris, I know this. I mean, how many times have you assumed as a CISO that something was running well in your organization only to be disappointed later?
Yeah, look, that is the cornerstone of why I'm such a fan for this approach. Like I can't count how many incident scenarios, some of them national level cyber incident scenarios that I've had to work through my career. And every one of those circumstances, I had the technical ecosystem in place to detect and defend against it. It was either a risk compromise that was made and not tracked in a good way, a misconfiguration, a 0-day exploit that was unmanaged. And the reality is it's us not staying on top of our cyber hygiene or being ready to adequately defend in a quick and dirty way that has always been front of mind for me. So absolutely, the concept of using the most appropriate and relevant or local, hyper-local threat intelligence that applies to you, and then using real testing and evaluation mechanisms to make sure your defensive mechanisms work is absolutely instrumental and key to defending your organization in the right way.
Absolutely. And so again, encourage everybody to check out this project. There's lots of other great projects at the center that can help you operationalize this and get you started on this journey. And as we've always said, aircraft carriers don't turn on a dime, but they definitely turn. And it's our job as professionals to start steering the ship in the right direction that we need to go. One last thing I just wanted to put up, and I'm not going to go through this in the interest of time, but you can definitely check this out on the CTED website, is how do what do you focus on within these categories of threat intelligence, defensive measures, and testing and evaluation. And so this is a pretty comprehensive matrix that if you take just 20 minutes of your day and assess your organization, using the app on the website or the spreadsheet, if that is something that you want to do, you can answer these questions and you end up with a matrix and a histogram basically that shows the organization of where you maybe need to focus more effort in these three different categories that work from an integrated perspective. And there's a great paper you can get from PwC where for Japan, PwC Japan did an analysis of the financial sector to see how well the financial sector in Japan was doing in adoption and execution of a threat-informed defense. And they're really surprised by kind of the output of this report. So again, this is something you guys can do. There's a link, and we'll make this available after the webinar down below to this research paper. It's pretty interesting, and we strongly encourage you to take 20 minutes out of your day and measure your organization's effectiveness of using a threat-informed defense.
I have a
So
hypothesis on this, Carl. I'd love to
yeah,
just add 20
yeah,
seconds on
please.
that. I am terrified, given that both the nature of the siloing that we open this conversation with, and frankly, the historical propensity of how cybersecurity has worked in the past, how much shelfware we've dealt with, how many times people have stood in front of regulators and said that we have XYZ security tool, therefore we are secure. And I think threat intelligence kind of falls into that bucket. Like they need to demonstrate and evidence they have a capability, but the maturity of that capability is often under regulated or under evaluated, and therefore you go buy the best of breed threat intelligence technology that's out there, the commercial offerings, and you don't put the right kind of talent behind it. You don't put a systematic measurement of these kinds of maturity models, and you don't integrate it where it's supposed to, where it adds value. And it looks like everything else in security that we have seen in our past, where those breaches have taken place because you bought the number one XDR tool but didn't have a way to make sure it was deployed or reporting properly.
Well, and this is exactly what we're going to get into in our next section. So it's a great lead in, Chris, to that. I mean, if for those that are familiar with CTEM and have read the Gartner paper on it and read some other things that people are publishing, what you're going to notice is it's got the word CTI one time in that paper, and really doesn't do a good job of explaining from an optimization perspective how threat and CTI and other threat informed things, MITRE ATT&CK, TTPs, plays an incredibly prevalent role cross functionally, for all the other parts of the organization that we're going to talk about, like vuln management as an example, right? But I'm going to put a pin in that for a second. Otherwise, we're going to go someplace too quick. But we're definitely going to come back to this, and that's a great lead in for this next section. And for those in the audience that may not be aware, there's a market guide published just this week, earlier this week, from Gartner on AEV, which stands for Adversarial Exposure Validation. So this is a new market guide. It's a new category of technologies. Gone are the days of the BAS category, breach and attack simulation, and the APTAS, automated pen test as a service category, have both been collapsed into something called AEV. For the vendors that have been in these two disparate categories of technologies, this is kind of a mixed blessing from our perspective, to be direct. There's a lot of differences between APTAS and BAS, but the reality is, if you look at AEV as a new category, it has a very important place in helping people operationalize continuous threat exposure management. So in the whole, we think that this is a good move. I think the market will be confused for a bit on where does APTAS like features, functionality, capability fit, and where does BAS fit? But that's our job as vendors to help you understand and create playbooks going forward in order to operationalize what we're going to talk about today, which is CTEM. But hopefully, just on the little bit of information we gave you on MITRE and what we're going to talk about going forward, you understand that all three of these things need to work together in order to take a holistic approach. So let's jump into that just a little bit, Chris. And we're not going to
Yeah.
read all these words on this slide. We just wanted everyone on the webinar today to have access to this information, but we're definitely going to cherry pick some things, to drive into. And I think, when we think about exposure management, Chris, we've alluded to it. We're definitely going to talk more about it, but we end up with two sides of the house, don't we? We've got risk management and threat management,
Yeah.
and they're important. To your point you made it just a second ago, we've got to kind of pull some of this together to be able to figure out what this visibility to threat exposure is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like that's often the missing piece that, risk management are the guys that have the authority to talk to the board because the board understands risk. And the threat management folks are either live in the silo or, deal with the bits and bytes of cybersecurity that often doesn't translate well to the board. And there's reasons for that too, Carl, and that like the connective tissue between how the business runs, its dependence on the technology stack that makes the business run is often not richly understood as well. So it's part of the driving factor of how the CISO or the cyber dudes have to well connect to the business, understand it richly, and have a great relationship with IT to be able to describe the business platform, the business process, and its connection to infrastructure to be able to connect these two functions together.
Well, and what I've always said is that unfortunately, as and I'm a huge believer in MITRE ATT&CK, but it has a glass ceiling. It really doesn't make it out of the CISO's office. So you can't show up to the board of directors and talk about this TTP or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Talk
you
about
can't. I've literally tried to do that, and it doesn't work. And no, there's no attack navigator, attack map that like the board. Now, what the board does understand is most probable attack. Like these are the
yeah.
kinds of things we're going to see, and because of that, these are the kinds of things we're going to make sure we can stop. And here's how we're going to evidence that. And so, when I said the natural evolution of MITRE ATT&CK earlier in the intro, that's that nexus, being able to abstract away a little bit with a programmatic strategy that shows that you are following the use of a CTEM maturity model, that you do have the ability to analyze and understand what the most probable types of exploitive techniques against your most probable exposures are, and that you are using some functional method of assessing that, uh, using real continuous automation, hopefully, to be able to demonstrate that. And that's the CISO report card from my perspective. Are we safe? Well, I think so, because this is the most probable thing to happen, and I'm testing us for ability to stop that. And therefore, yeah, I think we're safe today.
Well, and I think you just nailed it. I mean, so the reality is exposure management, and we're talking about CTEM today, right? But at the end of the day, there's this concept of exposure management. The board understands exposure management,
Yeah.
and MITRE ATT&CK has an incredibly important uh, spot to play in how you frame that, right? Without talking about TTPs, they can get this right.
Yeah, totally, totally. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about it, but exposure is a big broad word to me. I mean, you got to think about what exposures really are. Exposures, starting with the business, have to do like, oh my God, like think about what happened in December of last year, and in terms of the assassination of the UHG CEO in the streets of New York City. But think of those exposures about their business practices, what they were doing in terms of running these board meetings and the executive security things that everyone's thinking about now. Also think about like what is the sentiment of your company, within its consumer population. That's an exposure if there's a lot of negative sentiment. Then to the digital pieces of like your identities, and especially if you have a lot of federated IT, you think about your attack surface on the internet and how that presents. You think about your physical attack surface in your buildings. Oh, by the way, we haven't even talked about state-sponsored attackers and MITRE ATT&CK and any of that. So like all of this stuff has to come together in a comprehensive way for you to understand what the broad connective tissue of your exposures are. And then you have to connect that to your most important risks, your most exposed assets, your most important business functions, your most critical digital assets.
And the reality of that is, all that information is, and this is why number two is so important. And we've hit on it already two times in this webinar today. Is that a lot of the information that you want to use to have that visibility, situational awareness and visibility, they're siloed. Those data sets are sitting in product A, sitting in product B, sitting in team A, sitting in team B, right?
Business
And
functions, like, when you think about like the connective tissue of physical to cyber, I mean, like people break into your buildings to hack into your network and stuff like that for those that have buildings. And like, who's responsible for that? Well, the facilities people are responsible in most organizations for physical security threats and things like and improving physical posture. And so, even as a security executive or a CISO, you have to span identities. Well, where are identities managed in the organization? Usually through HR, right? Like you have an identity program, but the birthright begins with the onboarding process and the background check and what you know. And you think about the know before thing with the the North Korean hacker being hired into the organization. Like that's all HR business process. And so, that's an exposure that you as a security leader with an understanding of what your exposures are have to drive into other business worlds. Um, Now, that's a silo, and so like there's four business silos, and we haven't even gotten to IT and how the exposures within IT are managed in terms of like your business infrastructure, your use of SaaS products, your governance to onboarding new platforms, your firewall presences, your patching infrastructure. You run down the list of a traditional IT org chart, and there's exposures in each one of those that are managed largely like bespoke teams. And so, how do you
So,
stay connected to all of those things?
all right, so we're going to move on to number three, and I'm going to tell you a story. I'll try to get through the story quick, and then I want you to respond to it. On one side of the house, you have vol management, and vol management team is usually some software that keeps track of assets and asset criticality and things like this. And hopefully, you're doing a good job, and you don't have a bunch of shadow IT out there, right? And so they're definitely thinking about vuln prioritization because they don't have enough people to go patch all the different things they got to take care of. And so, we have prioritization efforts just on that infrastructure, which by the way, isn't all the things you own and operate. It's a well understood part of the business, right? But you're working on prioritizing that. But aren't they just prioritizing that in a vacuum
Often,
today?
often they are, and that's incredibly worrisome. I can reflect on that. You think especially like Microsoft's gotten pretty good about patching, Linux is pretty good about patching. First off, let's talk about who does patching. Usually in an organization, it's not just a patching team. The end user support team patches desktops in a rolling patch ring set of windows. The server teams manage patches based on the needs of the business and updating the applications to keep them current or secure. Microsoft, Linux, Apple probably have different sets of patching teams depending on those operating systems. Are usually not the same team. So that alone already gives you four, potentially 3 to 4 different sets of stakeholders to maintain, operational presence. Then you got to deal with the business and third-party apps and the apps that they manage. What's the cut line of patching? Who patches browsers? Who patches Apache struts? Who patches business apps? If you run a federated IT shop where you deliver a platform, the business runs its apps, and that's where it gets gnarly in terms of dealing with those kinds of things. And I can tell you, my experience is that especially when you work in high-end institutions with very tech competent, capable people within the business that build their own apps or run their own solutions, is that why do I need to patch this, Chris? Why do I need to do that across all the other specific technology and security asks that you have of me? Why is this the most important thing to do? And so this approach is a key informative way when you think of things like KEV and that framework as a way to say, look, this vulnerability is incredibly exploited based on state-sponsored actors or specific script kiddies today. And oh, by the way, there's evidence of that from the knowledge of KEV of it happening to our financial services or whatever institution you're in. And oh, by the way, it's connected to, if you do a really good job of this, an attack path and the fact that we know that this could be potentially exploited because if they get access to this specific exposed asset, they can lateral move into it and exploit that particular thing. So here's a model, a threat model, if you will, that I've put together of the most probable kill path or words that I've used in the past. And I like that language. It says that this is why you need to focus on this. And so now you've done your homework. You've convinced your business partner that why they need to do that thing first. And that's an enormous amount of effort to be able to do that. So that's why this maturity model and this automation needs to be driven into this process.
Well, let's double click on that. And so I've got a friend who's CISO at a very large company for 7 years in a row now. Any given year, they have 1 million unpatched systems. 1 million, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there's a lot of great reasons for that. There's some of them that are unsupported operating system. They have thousands of servers that drive a e-commerce app that have unsupported operating systems, and the old applications written in C, and they can't port it, and blah blah blah, right? So that's
Yeah.
never going to change. They got another application with thousands of servers that generates $5 million a second. So it's not active, so they're never going to patch that either. By the way, it's just not going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
Um, and then they've got their another whole massive set of things that are hard and difficult, and the CVSS scores not that high, and blah blah blah, right? And so for the things like that are unsupported, they're going to zero trust. So they're creating communities of interest and trying to do application flow control through those communities of interest, but they don't really test that very often, right? Um, but it seems to me, Chris, that if an organization has good asset management, if an organization could pull all that data from a CTEM discovery perspective into a system, if that system could generate all the likely attack paths for exploitation, to those systems, if it could prioritize that, and if you could validate, which is a big part of the CTEM architecture, which paths are dead ends, which means you don't have to worry about it,
Yeah.
but which paths are active, but then more importantly, tell you that you have compensating controls that can
Yeah.
interdict an adversary from a prevention or detection perspective who's trying to take advantage of that mission critical asset with a KEV. Now, wouldn't you be in a better position to report to the board or to somebody that, hey, we have this mission critical app, it's at risk, there are attack paths to it, but we validated that the compensating controls are working. Is
Let
that
me
a
give you a real war story around that from my past. Um, how do you deal with tech debt? Like this is like just like security shelfware. This is another, I think, pattern that a lot of folks fall into. I've got some tech debt I've got to deal with. We don't want to modernize it. It's making money for us, but it's non-strategic. Whatever we can do to buy down as much of the operational risk as we can. Um, CISO, what do we do? Let's put a ring fence around that. Let's isolate it. Let's monitor the hell out of it. If we see an issue, we'll suffer the consequences of downing the app so we don't expose the broader business to this tech debt. Now we live in a world, especially with the nature of how the weaponization of state-sponsored attacker type exploits that take advantage of kernel level operating system vulnerabilities and all the things that MITRE ATT&CK is really good at explaining. Do ring fences work anymore? Can you hop over them because of the fact that your critical infrastructure to manage that tech debt is the very channel for exploitive movement? And so that's a challenge that like I put out there now. I've dealt with a federated merger and acquisition, if you will, of a business where one component of it was identity centrally managed and another component of it was independently managed. And the idea was let's separate these business functions together with a firewall. And I said, well, will a firewall do anything given the fact that we have to maintain central critical infrastructure intra Microsoft services? And if our key threat vector, as to most people's, is ransomware and ransomware like type of attacker behavior, and we know what the TTPs are going to be associated with that, if they get an initial foothold, will they just go right through the firewall because of the protocols we have to allow? And the reality of the answer was, yeah. Well, good. That's a great learning that this process would follow. That why would we spend the money and the effort segmenting off that part of the business when the reality is it wouldn't stop the most probable attack? It would be valuable. It may stop other types of cyber events, but the one that I care the most about, the one that's most probable to happen, wouldn't actually be effective. So we should probably
well,
rethink this.
and that's a perfect lead into the number four, by the way, because for everyone, that is looking to establish a CTEM like program. By the way, over in London, I met with some FTSE 100 companies this week, and they all have established CTEM programs now. They have a director of CTEM, which is cross functional, and for those in the audience, you should know they've already reorganized a lot of those silos that we talked about
Mm,
above. The vulnerability management team now reports to the SOC as part of
mm,
CTEM.
mm.
And that's, for a lot of people, they're going to find that shocking. But it really gets back to number four here, my ability to respond quickly. And so, as part of CTEM, discovery is probably one of the most important components where now you're integrating all these disparate systems and the data that they represent into a more holistic kind of view so that you can do prioritization, so that you can ask questions, right? So that you are threat informed. And if your CTI team is taking 4 weeks to produce a report, you have an efficiency problem. Like
Yeah.
that's not going to be timely enough to put that report into CTEM in order for organizations to ask the question, do we have good visibility over that particular threat? Do we have coverage, for those TTPs? Do we have assets with attack paths that, can tickle that KEV as an example? So, Chris, can you talk about the need for speed?
Well, one, I applaud the folks in the UK for being more progressive in its organizational evolution. I think that's great. I hope we see a pickup of that here in the States. I think there's a lot of education to your point of what Attack IQ Academy is for and whatnot is good. Second thing I would say is I think it's philosophically I think the vuln management living in ops or an operational function. I frankly have a bit of a different mindset that I try to bundle all of your asset discovery functionalities under one, what I'd call business security function. So I've kind of got an outcropping of operations, and you think of your cloud configuration, like your whizzes and things like that, your application security, SAST and DAST technologies, and your vulnerability management. These are all scanners that look for problems of either unpatched system, unmanaged software, misconfigurations, and you put that into one tower that is business facing every day because they're the partner to keep the business focused on that. But that's an operational extension. So dotted line to ops in many ways is the way I think of it because they're where the rubber meets the road and how the business is managing their tech or how the business is relying upon IT for the delivery of that tech. Third thing I would say is that this is back to that, I think, security culture problem that we talked a little bit about of shelfware that we've experienced in our past. Look, I have a thing and it works well, but like that no longer works. For security to be good, you've got to be culturally maniacal about discovery and making sure there aren't, like we use this term in my past called no dark corners in your environment. And how do you know that? And like that comes with both the ways you perversively surveil your environment from the inside out, and your typical discovery type vulnerability scanners and things like that, in a concrete process to actually take the findings that pop out of that and get them dealt with. Are these new IoT devices in the environment that are being dropped on? Are these personal devices getting onto our network? Is this new software that's being unauthorized deployed? Like that is a full-time job in even small institutions of like, what the hell do I even have to defend? Then there's the outside in perspective. We talked about, some of the areas of exposure and being maniacal about understanding about rogue IT and, rogue SaaS platforms and things like that, that people may be authenticating to, and the birth of the ITDR space that looks for people logging into things. That's an area of exposure visibility, both inside out and outside in. Your internet scanners and your threat intelligence about both your SaaS platforms and your key partners and vendors. And Lord, man, like the hardest part of the job that ties into this, that is kind of the unspoken, oh crap, in security is, your dependencies on third parties and business
Well,
continuity components to
it,
that.
it is true, and just bring us back just a little bit. I mean, what we want to talk about, like what we're focused on here, in whether it requires a reorganization,
Mm,
right? And sometimes to break bad culture, you have to do a reorg. I'm not advocating for reorgs, but my primary focus is the frequency and severity of breaches is going up year after year, and there's no reason to expect that it won't over the next 5 years. Our
right.
organizations, our organizations today, right-sized and organized in order to fight the cyber war. And the reality is most corporations, because of risk management being on one side and threat management being on another, they're
Mm,
not task organized to sustain kind of sustained attacks from a cyber defensive operational perspective. And for a lot of corporations, like it's hard to talk like this, but another way you can say it is I only have so many IT and security people. We're dealing with
yep.
so many incidents on a daily basis. My people are tired. They're working every Saturday, blah, 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 blah. If you're not going to get 50 new people that means you're not organized right to do sustained operations, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so what I think is important about CTEM and what it potentially represents, as a framework, is an opportunity for organizations to task organize around this construct of exposure management and whatever organizational changes you need to make sure that the data flows in from a discovery perspective in order for people to violently execute against that data and make better decisions and decision support. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
It does. It does. I would say that like your task organization concept, whether it be reorg or by task, drives efficacy. Um, the connective tissue between the ruthless prioritization that has to take place. I can't fix everything all at once. So what am I fixing first? That's the risk part. Why am I fixing that first? That's the threat part.
Yep. All right. So for everybody, we're talking through this, and I hope the audience is finding it interesting. Just understand, like from a CTEM perspective, these are the things you're thinking about and working on. But MITRE, has a definite role in every aspect of how you think about the programization of a CTEM in your organization, whether you're small, large. You're not going to be able to do everything. You're going to cherry pick those things that makes sense for your organization. And obviously, there's a number of other things that you can look at specific to the framework with security testing validation and aligning to business objectives and looking at bringing in compliance now. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I've been having this week on DORA in the EU and what the impact is, whether you're a European Union organization or a business in the US that does business with financial services people in the US, to include SaaS companies like AttackIQ. We are impacted by DORA and things like that, NIS2 and other things like that. And so I do think keeping in aligned with our construct of convergence between risk management and threat management, now MITRE ATT&CK, has things to say about risk. We've done a MITRE ATT&CK mapping to NIST 853 as just an example. You can probably expect in the future a mapping to other frameworks that are important. But just in the interest of time, Chris, I do want to kind of double click on CTEM and AEV real quick, and particularly the importance of discovery. And you articulated earlier in the webinar today, bringing into house the people responsible for just that have the data that needs to be aggregated in a way in order to paint a more holistic picture of the attack surface of the organization, right? And whether that lives under a single a business unit that manages that, or a director that manages that, or just having a construct within your organization that helps bring and automate that discovery data into this exposure management process so that people can prioritize and make better decisions. Can you talk just a little bit about, where, if your organization, other organizations are today, from an exposure management perspective, and how, bringing us back to threat informed defense. I mean, I have a CTI report that, I'm a financial sector company, FinSec, with the following TTPs and capabilities are coming after me. What questions do you want to be able to ask very quickly in your organization in order to kind of report to the people that matter that you guys are okay?
Yeah, right. Well, this is frankly intelligence tradecraft kinds of questions that you would ask, like the validity of the source and where I got it from, its applicability to me, the probability of the exposure or the specific issue that I'm worried about. Is this comprehensive enough? Do I need to get other sources of information? And
Well,
and frankly,
let's say it's solid. Let's say you have actionable intel that you have
yeah.
an adversary with the following capabilities
So
is
we're
targeting.
convinced it's real. Okay, now like what does this apply to? And what's the next hop from it? Like, never is it straight to the heart. There's always, a component of operation for the adversary. And so this is where, your discovery has to be handed off to someone that owns a specific defensive function, and where that relationship between, as I'm the threat guy, I have credible information here we need to execute on. I need to do that fast. I need to know, is it real? And that's where, I think automation discovery really matters. Can I actually exploit this thing right now? Do I have the ability to automatically determine if that's exploitable or not?
So, at your level, I mean, I'm sure you're asked, are we okay? Right?
Uh,
And that's a
Oh,
complex that's a complex question because, you know, there's no 100% answer that's going to, satisfy everybody, right? But
that's right. That's right. But I would say that the short answer to that, Carl, is, are we okay? It's like, it's a real and relevant threat. I believe I have comprehensive discovery of what we're exposed to from it, and I've tested the validity of that. It is exploitable, and I have a defensive mechanism in place that is working against it, and therefore I think we're okay. I mean, if you're not walking that logic path in those conversations, then you're going to find yourself, the bad assumption one day.
well, so let me say it a different way and tell me if I say this right or not. So I've got to know what I own, right? I got to
Yeah,
understand, what my surface area is. I have to understand what the capabilities of my defensive measures are. I mean, do
yep,
I own things that can interdict, in this case, Fin 6, right? Um, and are they properly configured to do what I assume that they're doing, right?
that's
And
right.
so if I come in and someone says, "Hey, we have operational intelligence that Fin 6 is targeting, organizations like yours," you want to be able to, very rapidly, again, time matters, be able to understand what your surface area is, be able to understand, like, if you have a mission critical asset that has a KEV that this particular adversary likes to take advantage of, that either that thing is patched, or if it's not patched, that you have compensating controls that interdict anybody going after an attack path that would try to, tickle that thing. Would that be accurate?
That's right. That's exactly how the process has to work, and it has to work at, operational speed. You know, you know, 60 seconds to discover, an hour to quarantine, and, was it 12 hours to remediate or whatever? Like, I don't even think that those timelines are real and relevant anymore. I mean,
Well, matter of
attackers
fact,
use automation to exploit in the moment.
yeah. So with Dora, you have 4 hours,
Yeah,
4 hours,
yeah.
right?
You
You
can
have to
already see
report,
that tightening down now. The
right?
reality of it.
So it's I think, in different countries it's gonna be a little bit different. Luckily, U.S. doesn't, or not luckily. I don't
Let's
know
say
where.
luckily.
I don't think it's likely, but all right. So we're coming up on time. I do want to. We'll make these slides available for everyone. I'm going to blow this out. I do want to just double click on this real quick, and this is a horrible slide. I literally just threw this together very quickly, but I strongly believe there must be convergence of risk management and threat management. In fact, MITRE has been responsible for arguably two of the most important frameworks in the last 30 years around MITRE CVE and MITRE ATT&CK, both addressing both sides of this house. And I think what a lot of people, and this by no means is a comprehensive, stack of what to do on each side of this house, but I wanted to just kind of illustrate, how important it is for, people that are responsible for identification of assets, asset management, asset discovery, patch management, mitigation, remediation of patches, like to do that in a vacuum and not be threat informed, Chris. You're losing a golden opportunity, for these teams to work together and make better decisions. And after all, I mean, I think this is the power of what CTEM can bring to organizations to do this right. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, like this clearly articulates the, a component of the silos that we talked about early in the webinar. But that bottom layer being, the threat intelligence and situational awareness is largely your validator of, you actually have good identity and asset discovery and visibility. And if these two things, if you're not using the right part of the quadrant there to QC the left, then you're doing this wrong. Your risk prioritization and assessment is driven by business context, but business context is affected most by most most probable threat. And so, like, how do you provide business context in the absence of that? It's definitely important to the business, but it's also highly exposed because of how it presents to the web. And that those two things must come together to actually articulate risk in a good way. And then, the point of the pyramid, or the Maslow's hierarchy of security needs, that, like, organizations are far too volatile, often very federated, understaffed, and the teams are working against these missions. If they're not working in an incredibly integrated and continuous way, and taking advantage of all of the available automation that's being developed out there, and making it part of their systematic life cycle of how they're managing security, they're already missing out. They're already missing the opportunity here. It's great the work that MITRE ATT&CK and has presented, and where MITRE has brought the exposure management and CVE from a decade ago, and MITRE ATT&CK from like 8 years ago now, and like bringing these two things together with this, two sets of frameworks that can help with this.
Yeah, so I'm going to leave the audience with just three thoughts, and then I'll let Chris leave them with one or two as well. The first one is you cannot manage what you don't measure. You absolutely can't. And the fact that the risk side of the team and the threat side of the team in most organizations are not working together very well means that you're already managing to a lesser good outcome than you could if you had a more cross-functional unification of systems, data, and decision making between the teams. So that's number one. Number two, in order to bridge this gap between threat and risk, the CTED has published a project called Prioritization of Known Exploited Vulnerabilities. This is a mapping of all KEVs that people care deeply on the risk management side of the house to MITRE ATT&CK TTPs, how adversaries take advantage of those KEVs. And so even if you do nothing coming out of this webinar, but take a look at that project, take your two sides of the house and have them have a discussion about the mapping of TTPs to KEVs and what that means to your organization, or the assets at least that you have with KEVs in your organization, you'll score a lot better on that MITRE evaluation we talked about at the very beginning of this webinar today. Last thing is, and we've kind of advertised this a little bit, but please check out AttackIQ Academy. It's absolutely free. We have almost 70,000 students in it in 190 countries. Taking lots of different courses on optimization of MITRE ATT&CK framework. Many of these courses are the projects that we sponsor inside of the CTED and help you understand how to take advantage of that research and pull it into your organization and use it. And then, Chris, I'm going to cut this back over to you for one or two last thoughts that you may have for the audience.
Yeah, look, I'll put the practitioner lens on what you just said, because I think they're all great and relevant things. Metrics matter for real, and the board's demanding them. And it's hard. Security metrics is really hard. And so there's consumable data metrics that, how many assets do I have in the environment? What's their patch level and all of that? There's also soft skill metrics, management metrics. You look at like the CIS-18 and the four categories of measuring your control profiles and things like that. You look at what you showed today in terms of, are you actually at MITRE's framework for evaluating your maturity curve on that? You got to use those. And those are great management tools to be able to articulate your maturity, what you need for funding, the investments that you're trying to drive towards and whatnot. And so if you're not using them, you need to use them. I think we talked a lot about the silos and how to be a silo breaker. And like the CISO is of growing, from my perspective, depending on how your roles are defined, a growing senatorial role where you got to reach across a lot of aisles to be effective. There's lots of intelligence that you need to be sharing and influencing due to the connective tissue of humans, physical plants, digital infrastructure, and services. And you got to work across all the delivery partners that go and do all of those things to both get intelligence to inform them and help your defensive posture. So be more diplomatic in who you are. And then lastly, world's moving. For old salt CISOs that got gray beards like me, it ain't what it used to be. There's a lot of new capabilities, a lot of new frameworks, a lot of new ways to manage priorities and tell the story about what you need. And this is a great example of one. So get progressive. There's a lot out there that can help.
That's great feedback, Chris. Thank you. Liz, we have a little bit of time. Do we have any questions that may have surfaced during this?
Yes, we did have a couple questions. Based on your experience, would you share your thoughts on best practices in shifting from silos to better cohesive exchange?
Yeah.
Chris, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's probably with me. I think first and foremost, this is back to that senatorial comment that I made here at the end. Uh, First off, be unafraid to bring it up. If you're reporting to the board, you should use that. Like, we need to break these silos. You need to articulate the value and like make it clear as a management paradigm that this is what your peers need to be doing, and you got to work top down. This is all soft skill EQE things, and there's a tendency, like the two kinds of CISOs, three kinds of CISOs. Carl and I have talked about this in other webinars. Of You got the operational guy that's used to working in a SOC that elevates. You got the risk guy that's used to managing risk, elevating. Um, it, when you get to that level, for you to be effective to break silos, you got to build relationships. Like, you got to go befriend the head of HR to understand how identities are managed and what the threats are to people, emulating or becoming a false identity in your environment, and the controls you got to put in place at the onboarding process. You got to go make friends with the CSO if you're not that person, to make sure you understand that the what intelligence about your physical facilities and what's happening in the real world around your executives and things like that, and the types of intelligence you may come from that. There's no easy button to make that happen, other than the CISO sits at the heart of all of these areas. And Rafik, I'm trying to remember his name, the CISO mind map is a great slide of like all of your responsibilities. For you to be effective in all of those responsibilities, you got to be a partner.
So I love that mind map. I remember we used to use that a long time ago. The other thing, for organizations that are highly political, and sometimes it can be difficult for management plan change and organizational change. I've often used a fusion center construct where you create a process action team, you create a fusion center that's cross-functional. It's mostly a virtual team, but the purpose of it is to really start sharing information that makes sense from a cross-functional perspective, so that people have better information from other departments in order to make better decisions in their department. And often in the beginning of this, which can be kind of semi-official, these things actually, the organization comes to depend on the information that's produced by that fusion center. Sometimes, people have done this with purple teams. It's just an example of a construct of, red teams and blue teams, which often didn't work together very well because the red team wants to break things and they don't really speak blue team stuff, and blue team just wants to defend and they don't really, speak red team stuff. The benefit of bringing those together was fairly obvious to people later in life. But the same thing is true from a fusion center construct. And if people are interested in that, we built quite a few of those and can talk about how that helped organizations move more in this direction.
Yeah.
Liz, was there any? Oh, did you want to amplify that, Chris? Or?
Just dovetailing a final and then we'll get to the next question. That's um, an excellent example of like not of diplomacy. Like, instead of like, I'm going to come give you threat intel, it's like, you're going to be a partner. Come work with me. Have intelligence to share. We need to work together on that. And again, back to the EQ construct of like not being threatening, organizations being political. You want to be valuable in everything you do.
Yep. Liz, do we have anything else?
Sure, yeah, we have a couple more.
Sure.
So in relation to third-party relationships and the supply chain, what are
Mm.
your thoughts on challenges in prioritization of risks, especially when considering outside factors like climate change, geopolitical, and cultural nuances, to name a few?
Mm. That's a big question. Give me 60 seconds on that one. I think philosophically, this comes down to that risk management stuff. You got to really understand, you got to think about buying habits. How many vendors does an organization have? I've never been anywhere that didn't have hundreds to thousands of vendor relationships. And so how do you figure out which one of those are the most strategic? being a good business partner, understanding your key business platforms and how your business works, and then unpacking who those third-party relationships are, and frankly tying in like your business continuity practitioner, because that's the people that should actually understand who these key relationships. So it starts with that inventory, that discovery, like we talked about, who matters most. Then you got to have a comprehensive strategy to working that relationship. And that starts with your lawyers and how the relationship is structured and how you will, legally partner with that organization. Then your third-party assessment team, your third-party risk team, has to be incredibly connected to that organization through that legal framework that you put in place in the contract. And what does that mean? It means that I'm not going to send a questionnaire to you once a year for you to fill out and update. We're going to have quarterly QBRs, and we're going to get together with our most strategic partners and understand what your security program looks like. I may demand specific access to logs or information about incident activity or configuration changes or access control to understand that. But to do this well often requires, again, a change to a different part of your organization that may need some of that reorg structure that says, I'm going to get real significant technical depth with my most strategic third parties to make sure I trust them. And that's part of how you get intelligence about what's going on.
So Chris, there's so much in that question to unpack. I want to push you in one direction. We're over time, team, but we're going to keep riffing. If you want to hang on with us here, we're going to go through some of the questions. Both Chris and I, we don't get to see each other often, so this is a good time for us. But it's interesting because if you think about third-party risks today, just to double click on that, most organizations, like, as a vendor, I do these DPAs and security assessments,
Yeah.
prior to procurement, and they're brutal and they're difficult. And what I found and heard from like a lot of people is not AttackIQ, of course, but is like, these are lie sheets. Like you fill them out, and the
Yeah.
organization, gets to a place where they accept it, but they never come validate it, right? They don't.
Right.
And they're not more secure because of this dumb process. I mean, it's
No.
just this is bureaucratic process. It doesn't mean your supply chain is secure, right?
It's a legal
So
control, Carl, is
that's
what
right.
it is. What
But,
it is it demonstrates you did diligence. It doesn't mean the
well,
diligence is good.
but here's where I'm going with this. This is the fun part. So I'm in these meetings this week, and they're like, "Hey, you know what? We want to extend CTEM to these third-party, suppliers. We want to be able to not to actually exercise exposure management from as them part of our broader thing. We want to test them, right? So
Yeah.
how do we do that, right? And, I've heard this question before, and so I said this is a procurement issue. They have to put in the contract they reserve the right to run a test or request a test or whatever it is, right? But I think that's one thing that doesn't happen very often today. But do you see that as something becoming more pervasive?
I see a lot of resistance to it. I can tell you that. The desire is there, but the reality is, like, the regulations are changing where you're accountable as a buyer now to third and fourth, even fourth party risk. I mean, an organization that outsources all of their IT services to a crappy service provider is highly probable of getting breached if they're not managing that subcontract well. And if they're holding your data or a critical business process for you, that's huge. So,
Right.
like, for me to get comfortable with you is not, and like that's how the conversation at the relationship starts. And this is back to that diplomacy senatorial thing that I said earlier. Who's the buyer in your business? Like, okay, well, like if these guys are important to you, then this is what we need to do a good job. And that comes with, like, I want exposure management capabilities. I want to be able to do discovery in their environment. I want access to the inside of their environment some way to give me purposeful validation. Because, lie sheets, that's kind of fun. I like that. But yeah, right, like it doesn't get validated. And I'm liable. Like, and so you got to put the buyer, your lawyer, and yourself in the room to say, I can't tell you if any of this is true if they don't give me the ability to come and check it.
Well, look, we're gonna do one more question, and I've got access to this now, Liz. So I cherry picked this one out. For those of you that we haven't answered your question, we will answer that and email you back. Just FYI, we'll do that after the session. But one of the questions was based on your experience. Would you share thoughts on best practices in shifting from these silos to better cohesive kind of organization.
Best practices. What do you
I mean,
start with?
well, let me maybe tee you up. I mean, the reality is, remember the comment: the aircraft carrier doesn't turn on a dime, but it
Yeah.
turns. Are there some low-hanging fruit areas that you would recommend that people look at to consolidate first, where they get either economies of scale or efficiency, or maybe even better, force multiplication of having those two things together?
Yeah, totally. I think that if you think about low-hanging fruit between like operations and risk, how can you dig into that? We'll stare at your risk dashboard, and the thing that goes to the board, and then compare that to like where is the threat intelligence behind informing the probability of those things, and where's the systematic conversation that can start taking place, because the operators frankly produce a report that goes to the board about operational experiences, but how is that full circle enveloping the types of threats that you're exposed to that are affecting you, and the probability of the types of risk that you're dealing with. That's one area
So,
to start first and
so who
foremost.
are you merging together there? Be more
Oh,
specific.
like your if you have a TI function or an operations function that's doing any kind of retro, types of incidents, and your head of GRC, they need to be deeply connected. And it is not just what the business does, but it is the type of incidents that could affect the business. That's a big one. Another one is, who are your cyber defenders, and recognizing that the guys that run patch management, the guys that run the firewalls, the guys that run, and remember, those are likely federated functions. Um, Putting that simple purple team construct and like working in coherence together of these are the types of KEV scenarios that we're talking about. Like these are the most probably exploited. Patch this stuff first and automate that, and then let them use it. You don't have to tell them to do it. Like anything that shows up KEV level 5 and CVSS level 10 automatically goes to the top of the priority list. Work
Yeah.
that way. Those are just a couple of very simple ways that you can use the common automation frameworks and fabric that's out there to automatically drive your defenders to have more systematic priorities.
Well, I'm going to give you my vote because you didn't ask. My vote is make your vuln management program threat informed. If you do
Yeah,
nothing else, if you don't have
that's
any,
what I'm describing. We're in agreement. That's
yes,
exactly what
that's what vuln
I
man.
said.
They're the misfit toys of the organization. Nobody likes to talk to them, but the
Yeah.
reality is they've got amazing data. They have amazing data that you can make threat informed and help the organization on your journey to CTEM really start that discovery process and using data to make better decisions even in the early days and certainly threat informed. So, with that said, Chris, I'm going to wrap us up. For those that are on the call, we will be providing a recording shortly after this to your email so you can share this with your family and friends if you found it useful. And Chris, as always, my brother, really appreciate you joining us today and giving up some of your family time for us.
No worries. Love your show, as you say, Carl. Glad to be here, and I'll close with, in terms of like that last question and the broader spectrum. As the CISO, if you're not waking up every morning thinking about who wants to hurt you, why, how they would do it, and like which one would probably come at you first, you're already thinking about this in the wrong way. And that's what being threat informed really is to me. And what are the different ways those are going to happen? And it's great that the partnership that AttackIQ has with MITRE and the evolution of that product, and the maturity that's coming with that. I hope that the listeners in the audience are beginning to come along with like the adoption of these capabilities to help better defend themselves. You can't defend all the things, so figure out what matters to you first.
Well, great. Thank you, audience. We appreciate you staying with us. 10 minutes past the hour here, and look forward to talk to you again, Chris. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.